Good morning, everybody. My name is Life Lagueros. I'm a professional development coordinator at the Tarrant Institute for Innovative Education. And I have the great honor this morning of introducing Shevrin Venet. Alex is a friend of mine, and she's an absolutely amazing human being, first and foremost. If you ever need help or thinking, she's incredibly generous with her time and expertise. And even to the point of helping sometimes when you don't ask for it. So one of the things that Alex has helped me with over the years is holding me in loving accountability. And there's been times when I've misstepped, and she will call me in and help me learn. And I'm so incredibly appreciative for that. That's the kind of person Alex is. She brings her values, her expertise, her identity, her authentic human self in all spaces that she moves. And that's a rare thing. And she moves in lots of spaces. So, professionally, she was a teacher and leader at the Centerpoint School here in Vermont, a therapeutic school in Winooski. Now she teaches and mentors in so many different ways with undergraduate students at the Community College of Vermont, in-service teachers at Antioch University, Castleton. She does all sorts of professional development and school change work on the ground in schools. Virtually she's, attended and known nationally and globally. So she's an amazing person. And recently, in the last year or so, she had this book published that has really changed things in education, I think, in many ways. And for many of us has brought insights that were so powerful in terms of the intersection between equity and trauma-informed practices and the way that they're inextricably linked. And this incredible insight around the fact that trauma is not something that's brought from outside of schools only, but in some cases, the harm within schools can cause trauma responses. And thinking about how to systemically change things so that we have more human-centered education learning environments. So just absolutely incredible. Alex, we love you. And we're so lucky to have you here today. So folks, while she's giving her remarks, her presentation here at the beginning, please try to be engaged. You can certainly do that through the chat. Alex is a big promoter of an active chat back channel there. So one thing to note, you'll see the little chat box at the bottom of your Zoom screen there, and you want to turn that to panelists and attendees, so that goes out to everybody. So feel free to have some relevant conversations going there. And we should also have some time for some Q&A at the end. So if you would like to ask some questions of Alex, you can put them in that, you can use that Q&A box, and those will go to the panelists. And after Alex is done presenting, we'll ask her to respond to some questions. So I'll turn it over now. Alex, you're an absolute go-to person around this stuff. And we really appreciate you being here today. And I also, as you know, am a big admirer of your cat, Charlie, and seeing the fun facts on your website. I love that Charlie got a shout out. And you also mentioned the 251 Club, which it said in there, like, ask you, how many of the towns in Vermont you've visited at this point. So I don't know if you have an updated number for us to get started, but I'm sure we'd love to hear it. Thank you, Alex.
Sure do. And sadly, Charlie won't be making an appearance because she has to be shut out while I'm speaking. So maybe we'll hear her crying from outside the door. For the 251 Club, I think we're almost at 100. COVID has slowed us down a little bit. And so I think that we'll get there this summer. Hopefully we'll be out and about. All right. Hi, everyone. I'm so glad to be with you this morning. I feel like a little extra nervous because I know a lot of you in real life. And sometimes when I'm talking on Zoom, you can tune out the crowd. But today I'm excited because I see some of my buddies in here and some hopefully new friends as well. All right. So this morning, we're going to be talking about unconditional positive regard as a powerful equity stance. You'll learn more about what that means in just a moment. But first, I want to just take a brief second to get ourselves ready to learn. So what I'm going to do is just turn off my camera for about 30 seconds. You all already don't have your cameras on, but maybe you want to focus your eyes somewhere other than your screen. Maybe you want to scoot back from your computer a little bit. And you can use one of these options here on the screen or just take 30 seconds for yourself and just kind of settle into this morning. So I'll call us back together in about 30 seconds. All right. I also want to invite you, we've checked in with ourselves. If you want to check in as well with the room that we're in and you want to pop open that chat, drop it down so it goes to everyone, and maybe let us know what's in your mug and what's on your mug today. So for example, I have this mug with all these cute little drawings of dogs that I got from a dog drawing Twitter account I follow. And in my mug is some really lovely black tea. So if you just want to check in as a connector in the chat, let us know what's in your mug and what's on your mug. Or, your mason jar, your reusable water bottle, whatever you got going on this morning. You could also have what you wish was in your mug this morning. I'm jealous of the person I saw went to Sweet Simone's already today. That's making me want a nice pastry. All right, beautiful. Thanks for checking in, everyone. If you're still typing, keep going for it. And as we finish up our check-ins, I want to invite you all to take what you need. I mean this in a couple ways. One is that as we're learning together, pay attention to what your body needs. If you need to move around, if you need to take breaks from learning during my session, or really I would encourage as you go across any learning throughout the rest of your day, remember that, you only learn well when you feel well. And so take what you need to be engaged. And then also during my session today, I'll be mentioning trauma. I'll be mentioning some instances of inequities in schools, nothing too graphic today, but talking about this stuff. And again, as you go through your day, talking about equity issues, talking about all the hard work we're doing, it can stir stuff up. And so I always encourage people that if you notice after a learning experience that you're a little shaken up or a little maybe more unsettled than you'd like, reach out to those around you for some support. All right, so let's talk about unconditional positive regard. This is one of my favorite topics, so I'm really excited to dig into it with you all today. So to understand what the purpose of unconditional positive regard is, I want to talk about this advice: build relationships. This is advice that you will hear basically in any book on education, right? In any talk on education, especially when you're talking about topics like equity, like culturally responsive teaching, like trauma-informed teaching. You'll really hear this advice of build relationships. And this is great advice, right? We should build relationships. But something I think a lot about is that we don't always talk about what the quality of those relationships should be. What kind of relationships are actually powerful and effective when we are trying to do this deep and meaningful work with students? So what kind of relationships? My frame that I always go back to on this is called unconditional positive regard. I first learned about this when I worked at the therapeutic school. Shout out to my old coworker who I know is here. This was an approach that some of the leaders there brought over from their background in counseling and mental health. And so let's take a little trip into our time machine back to the 1950s and hang out for a second with Carl Rogers. Carl Rogers created an approach called human-centered psychotherapy, client-centered counseling. Maybe that rings a bell with you and resonates with ideas of student-centered learning, for example, very similar approaches, essentially putting the human at the center of this practice. And so when you go back and look at how Carl Rogers talked about this idea of unconditional positive regard, he was exploring it in the context of what should the relational conditions be for really powerful therapy, right? How should the therapist sort of hold that other person in relationship? And so he called this concept unconditional positive regard. And I love this quote as talking about what a client in this relationship feels like when they are experiencing unconditional positive regard. So he writes, one client describes the therapist as fostering my possession of my own experience, that this is my experience and I'm actually having it, thinking what I think, feeling what I feel, wanting what I want, fearing what I fear, no ifs, buts, or not reallys. And I just love that. And you can instantly see some of those connections with education, right? That we want students to be in possession of their own experience and their own knowledge, and to really feel like there are no conditions on that, inhabiting of themselves as full people. I think in the middle grades, especially, right? Students are developing that identity. They're exploring what does it mean to be a person. And so to have that sort of fully embodied experience is really beautiful. And so I'll be talking about this concept, which has moved right from just in the world of therapy to education and many other fields, right? People are really interested in how this can guide our work. And so I want to tell you a little bit more about it. And I'm going to go through sort of three key areas here about what unconditional positive regard makes possible for us as educators. So the first area I want to talk about is that unconditional positive regard is personal. So thinking about how can this transform personally my work as an educator and those interactions that I have with my students every day. So first, let me give you another way to think about unconditional positive regard. We heard about from Carl Rogers the perspective of the person receiving the unconditional positive regard. This is how I articulate the message that the person cultivating that unconditional positive regard is trying to send out in everything they do. So the message of unconditional positive regard is this: I care about you, you have value, you don't have to do anything to prove it to me, and nothing is going to change my mind. I care about you, you have value, you don't have to do anything to prove it to me, and nothing is going to change my mind. So this is really, it sounds simple. It's incredibly hard to make it happen, right? Because there's so many pieces. There's the first piece of just, I care about you. That requires seeing and understanding and accepting the whole person. So knowing our students well, understanding their communities, understanding identity and the way that people move through the world, really feeding into that idea that I care about you and I inherently see your value. So recognizing that every person has value and learning to see and appreciate that. The next part is hard. You don't have to do anything to prove it to me, right? So we are not waiting for evidence of greatness to know that our students are great. We are not waiting for evidence of kindness or respect to know that our students are kind and respectful. We're recognizing that their value, their goodness as a whole person is inherent, and they don't owe us any evidence of that before we believe it of them. And that piece of nothing's going to change my mind. So that's the truly, right, the unconditional part is that if you mess up, if you harm someone, if we have a rift in our relationship, if you don't do your work, if you have a hard time in school, it doesn't change my mind that you have value and that you are a full and valuable person, right? So it's not granting conditions. You know, this unconditional positive regard is very similar to when people talk about unconditional love, right? Positive regard, I think, is a more, when you think of mapping this concept to your professional life, it's not necessarily about cultivating a sense of love for each individual student, but it's about that stance that you're taking as you hold them in your care. But if you think about experiences with unconditional love, you can sort of feel what it feels like to be held in that stance, right? When someone is just accepting you, when you know that you don't have to show off for them or to do a certain thing so that they'll appreciate you. That's the experience that we want to give students as they're learning, is that they don't have to do anything special to be treated as though they're special. And so this is all, I think, a great thing to strive for, but I also want to put it in opposition with sort of what we might be moving away from. So to me, an unconditional mentality, a real cultivation of unconditional positive regard, it stands in opposition to another way that sometimes as educators we act, which is with a deficit or savior mentality. So a deficit or savior mentality can seem kind, it can seem caring, but it really takes this role that is dehumanizing. When we act sort of as a savior or put ourselves as the ultimate helper, right? Then we only leave students with one role, which is to be saved, right? Which is one role, which is to be helped. And so when we take that savior mentality, we're actually dehumanizing and boxing in our students from that full self, from that full value. And so when we cultivate instead that unconditional mentality, we are acting in solidarity. We view ourselves alongside students, walking with them toward the goals that they would like to reach. We witness their struggle, but we also witness their capacity to heal and heal themselves and heal one another, right? And we really see that if we truly care about someone and we truly value them, that means that we know that one person cannot be the be all end all, right? And so we work together to support one another. And so in that way, you know, if we are narrowing students into a role where they are being saved, we can't make our equity work real, right? We can only make our equity work real if we are fully recognizing the humanity of everyone involved. And so I want to ask you a couple what if questions. And if some what if questions are popping up for you in these sections, please feel free to add those in the chat and we'll hear from one another as well. When I think about unconditional positive regard as a personal stance and as something that we each cultivate within our relationships, I wonder, what if this helped us find the good in all of our students and all of our colleagues and in our communities? What if we practiced radical acceptance, no matter the behavior or no matter the day-to-day actions of any of our students? And what if unconditional positive regard was the default and the expectation in our schools? So I'll leave just a quiet moment for any other what ifs that folks want to think about. So unconditional positive regard is personal, but unconditional positive regard isn't just about how I may be relationally interacting with students, you know, in our side conversations or anything like that. Unconditional positive regard is also pedagogical. unconditional positive regard can guide the way that we teach and can be really embedded in the ways that we think about teaching. When I think about conditional and unconditional responses in teaching, one of the things I think about is all the ways that education can feel really conditional and can feel really transactional. So I want to read you this quote by Alfie Kohn, who has a fabulous essay called Unconditional Teaching that really digs into these ideas. And in that essay, he writes, "Unconditional acceptance is not only something all children deserve, it's also a powerfully effective way to help them become better people. It's more useful, practically speaking, than any behavior management plan could ever be." So what he's talking about here is the idea that many times our classrooms run on conditional acceptance. This shows up in our use of points and grades as a way to measure learning. This shows up when we use PBIS and token systems as a way to reward behaviors that we're trying to cultivate. Because ultimately, these things build that conditional sense that if I act this way, then I get that thing, whether that thing is an A or it's a tiger buck from PBIS, whatever that is. And it's conditional, right? I mean, it's literally called conditioning, right? That if you do this, you get that. And that can really be an enemy of learning, right? If we are worried about learning as a way to get a thing, then we can confuse, do I have the space right now to learn, or is it going to put me in jeopardy to take risks and then I won't get the thing that I was told I would get? And so when I think about unconditional positive regard, unconditional acceptance in our teaching, I think about creating spaciousness. That's something I'm thinking about, spaciousness. When a student knows that they will be accepted and told that they have value and their learning has value, and you cannot change my mind, right? Remember that part? Nothing you will do can change my mind. If we believe that students are smart and capable of learning, that they have wisdom inside of themselves, and that we are not putting ourselves in a position to validate or invalidate that through conditional rewards or conditional punishments, we're creating spaciousness for people to take risks, right? We're creating an environment where people, where students feel like they can be wrong, they can say the wrong thing, they can try something and not really have it work out because they don't have to prove to us that they're smart and capable. And also really seeing the ways that those messages about conditional acceptance of your intelligence are really just another way of offering conditional acceptance of your humanity. And so we're creating that spaciousness. Another thing that I think about is that these things feed into each other. I was thinking about a student that I was tutoring at the community college of Vermont here, and that one week she was really sick and she couldn't participate in her online classes. She emailed both of her professors and she said to them both, "I'm sick, I can't participate this week." One of her instructors emailed back and said, "I'm so sorry to hear that you're sick. I really hope you're feeling better. By the way, here's the work that you need to do." The second teacher said, "Well, you already missed another class and this is all the work that you're going to be behind on. I really think you need to talk to your advisor." Now, I'm exaggerating the tones a little bit, but she was reading both of these messages and being held in unconditional positive regard by the first teacher allowed her to really feel like it was possible for her to catch up. It was possible for her to persist. Feeling the lack of that human connection of being held with value by the second instructor made her feel like she was stupid. It made her feel like she wasn't good enough to be in college. And as we talked through this, I just kept thinking about it can be so small, right? We can make these radical changes to our pedagogy. We can try ungrading, we can do all kinds of big things, but it can also just be those small moments of validating humanity that allow our students that spaciousness to take risks and to learn. So as I think about unconditional positive regard as a pedagogical approach, I wonder, what if we move past all of these conditional markers of success like grades? What if we taught in ways that valued and validated the inherent skills and wisdoms and capacities of all of our students? And what if we all were able to create this spaciousness through our unconditional positive regard for learning? Give another quiet moment here for any additional what ifs that are rising for you. So the final layer that I want to talk to you about this morning of unconditional positive regard are the ways that unconditional positive regard is political. And by political here, I'm not talking about partisan. I'm meaning political as in connected to the systems of power, the structures of power that influence all of our daily lives, and the ways that policies, power, systems all interact with us personally as well. So in this way, unconditional positive regard is political because unconditional positive regard is a humanizing force in a system that can be very dehumanizing. And when I talk about the system being dehumanizing, I mean in a lot of systems are dehumanizing, but in our schools in particular, right? Anytime that you try to make something work for a large amount of people, some dehumanizing ways of making things faster and more efficient start to creep in. And, these don't have to look really stark. I mean, we can all think of examples like having to sit through standardized testing during a pandemic. That's pretty dehumanizing of a standardized way of measuring, right? But even smaller things within our schools, ways that we label students and group them and try to make things more efficient, even in small ways, can be dehumanizing. And so unconditional positive regard is a real humanizing pushback to that. If you really believe that each person has value, that they don't have to prove it, and that is unconditional, that pushes back against a system that's dehumanizing. And in particular, I think this can come up for schools when we think about the ways that we exclude, we push out, and we divide. I think about seclusionary discipline when we refer students out of the mainstream, when we pull them out when they're having a hard time. And this really ties in with a larger societal view that when people mess up or when people do harm, the best way to deal with it, says our society, is this conditional response of excluding them from society or sanctioning them and throwing them away. And we replicate this in our schools fairly often. We replicate it in big ways, right? When we suspend, when we refer out, but we also replicate it in small moments, right? Even those small moments when one student's having a hard time and we ask them to leave the classroom. That replicates some of those systems of power and some of those systems of policy that are dehumanizing in our world. And I come back often to this concept from Carla Shalaby, who talks about how there are no throwaway people. If we truly believe that every single person has value, we extend our care to every person, and that's unconditional, then we would never throw people away. This work is present on a larger systems level, right? When we think about How are we using the criminal legal system to throw people away? But zooming back into our classrooms, right? When we have individual students who are having a hard time, the difference between asking that student to leave versus pulling in that student and taking care in community. And so when I think about unconditional positive regard as political, I think about how do we use unconditional positive regard to ensure that there's no throwaway people and to pull people closer to us, to pull them into community because we care about them and they have value. And that last piece, right? And nothing's going to change our mind. What if as a community, nothing was going to change our mind about the value of each of our members? And so when times are hard, we pull them closer. So I wonder if we apply unconditional positive regard at the political level, what if we really use this to embrace the fact that there are no throwaway people? What if we dreamed of a society where this was really true, where unconditional positive regard was the norm and not just something that we were striving to create despite the norm? And what if we used our position as educators to create these spaces that would then have a ripple effect? Sometimes when I talk about this stance, people say, well, in the real world, that's not how you're treated. Your boss is not going to have unconditional positive regard for you. One thing I would push back on is I have worked for bosses that had unconditional positive regard for me. So, right, not totally true. But also, what if we didn't just try to replicate all the stuff that sucks about the rest of the world? And what if instead we created this container of unconditional positive regard and felt that, right? Embodied it, lived in it, understood what it really felt like, so that our students then are embodied with that knowledge of how good that feels, and they can bring that out and create it other places. So this isn't easy though, right? This is really hard because, like I said, truly taking an unconditional stance is not the way that a lot of other folks operate. And so you may find yourself swimming against the tide. It is also difficult to maintain, right? We're people. Students are going to bother you. You're going to have hard days. I know you all do have hard days right now. It is hard to truly maintain unconditional positive regard, especially when we are not being held that way by those in power and maybe shaping the conditions of our work. And so it requires that there is community buy-in. It requires that we check in and support one another. One of the ways that my old school made this really real was that we were constantly coaching one another and being coached and bringing up these concepts in our work together, so that if we were slipping away from it or we were so frustrated, we just wanted to reach for that conditional response, that instead we would be able to hold that spaciousness. It is also hard when you layer on dynamics of identity, when you layer on challenges when students students are not holding their teachers in unconditional positive regard necessarily, and navigating through how sticky that is really difficult. So I present all of this to you as an aspiration, but also something that you can start now, right? So you may not be able to, log off this keynote today and shift all of society so that everybody operates with unconditional positive regard in all the systems, right? Like you can't go snap your fingers and do that. Although if you can, I have a couple other requests for you. Right. So it may feel big. It may feel even really big to you to think about how to stop relying on conditional acceptance like grades and points within your personal practice. But there are ways that you personally can get started in cultivating this. There are things you can examine within your practice. There are students probably who you can really sit and have some honest conversations with yourself about what it will take for you to move from a savior mentality to an unconditional mentality with them. And so we can get started. we can have conversations in our schools about the ways that we are conditionally rewarding or punishing children. And we can start to make those kinds of shifts so that that's not the case anymore. And we can advocate together and work together around some of these larger things. We have collective power as educators, and so we can lean into that and use it. And so that's what I leave you with this morning before we have a chance to chat in a minute, is this idea that you can't do it all, but you can get started. And in fact, you have to get started. Our students deserve it, and we all deserve to work in an environment of unconditional positive regard for our students, for one another, and ourselves. Thank you all so much, and I'm looking forward to chatting in just a moment.
Thank you so much, Alex. Wow. Really appreciate it. I'm feeling ready to aspire, and I'm feeling very inspired. And we have a few minutes left for questions here. So a couple of folks have used the Q&A. That would be the spot. So if you throw something in there, then Alex and I can access them, and maybe I'll read them out loud, Alex, just for folks to be able to hear it. And while you're thinking, so the first question is one that I was thinking of too, just kind of thinking about the balance. So this person says, I'm a big proponent of choices and consequences, especially for middle schoolers that need boundaries for their brain, is the way they put it, which I think is great. How do we know when to allow space for conversation, brainstorming, et cetera, and when to hold the line? Examples include deadlines, separating, sending kids home if they physically harm someone. So any thoughts on that balance?
Yeah, so unconditional positive regard definitely doesn't mean that people just do whatever they want and it's fine, right? But to me, it's about the separation between responding to someone's behavior and responding to someone's self. I remember learning this about the concept of shame versus guilt. And this feels like a Brene Brown thing. I don't know if this is from Brene Brown specifically, but whoever said this said that guilt is feeling remorse over what you have done, and shame is feeling remorse about who you are. And so I think about that, it's fine to have natural consequences for things that are impacting others in the classroom. It's fine to have boundaries, all of that. And so I think it's about really thinking hard about how are we communicating in ways that are about, how others are impacted, about making choices, about being accountable in community versus shame. And in particular, isolation breeds shame. And so I think about really thinking hard about, when do students actually have to be separated out of the community? Often that is about safety, right? Like one of the examples was, if you physically harm someone, yes, you should establish safety and make sure people aren't around each other that are harming one another. But really thinking about how can we do more pulling in as opposed to sending out.
Thank you. And, I wonder, you just mentioned the boundaries, and I know you've done a lot of thinking about what boundaries make sense for teachers. And, unconditional positive regard sometimes just sounds like, oh, it's just like infinite. I just have to give everything to every kid and be the whole thing for every kid. I just wonder if you want to just comment on that a little bit as well.
Yeah. So on the, I had a slide about the savior versus the unconditional mentality. And one of those items there was that in a savior mentality, you do try to be everything to every kid. But in an unconditional mentality, I really believe that that mindset leads to more collaboration, because if you're recognizing that students have that inherent value and that they have that inherent worthiness, then it's devaluing of that to narrow in who's available to support them, right? We would actually be cutting them off from maybe needed resources and a community of support if we're trying to do it all ourselves. And so I really think that the other word that comes up for me with an unconditional mentality is solidarity. And so really seeing ourselves alongside students.
Thank you. I'm just thinking that, the connections that students have with so many adults is so important. One of your pieces that I've used and read and come back to is around boundaries, and it talks about being a bridge builder. And we have a question in the Q&A about, students who have been designated for services in some cases. So the question in the Q&A is about reconciling the deficit savior mentality with supporting ELL students, ELL in quotes there. And I think you could also extend it to something like students with disabilities. So do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah. A huge part for me of being able to cultivate that unconditional positive regard, cultivate the care and see the value is that I need to educate myself, right? I need to I know many Vermont schools are working on things like implicit bias and competencies around anti-racism and cultural responsiveness. That work is so essential because if you are layering stereotypes, if you're layering assumptions onto your students, then that for sure is not going to work with unconditional positive regard, because you can't really care about someone if you're holding those types of beliefs. And so I think around, any designated population of students, really, doing your work that you need to do around it, unpacking whatever it is you need to unpack, so that you can authentically see that value and truly understand that value. If anyone here is a nerd and wants to do some good reading about cultivating that sense of what the values are, there's a great framework called Community Cultural Wealth from, I believe the author's name is Tara Yasso. And there's probably someone in the chat who knows what I'm talking about and can find a link. But it's this great framework of thinking about this idea of cultural wealth. So what are those things that people have that you might not think of immediately as those strengths and assets?
Thank you. Just noting that title. So thinking about sort of systems and structural approaches, a couple questions here. The first one is kind of addressing your idea of always trying to include more. And they're asking about your thoughts on like a therapeutic space within the school for students who, continually cause other students harm or are unsafe in a quote unquote traditional classroom. And they're looking specifically at like a model where maybe they start their day there and then they can join the rest of the learning community at some point.
Yeah.
And they're feeling.
Yeah. So, that's a great question. And, I worked in a therapeutic school that was an outplacement, right? And I do think that there are times when students really need a very different environment. Maybe they need that specifically therapeutic support. And so my answer is a little more about thinking about the long game, because sometimes what students actually need out of those therapeutic spaces or alternative places, the actual need is connected to maybe having more personal connection and in-depth relationship with a staff who has a lower, caseload of students that they're getting to know. Maybe part of what they need is less sensory overstimulation versus the big classroom with 30 students in it. Maybe what they need is a flexible start to the day where they're not immediately asked to dive into really intense work. And so if you think about those kinds of needs, our schools don't have to be so bad for that kind of need, right? We could be shifting things so that those needs are met more broadly. And so I think a little bit about, two things are true at once. Yes, sometimes students really do need a different environment or approach. And how are we really examining our schools and asking ourselves, why can't we actually make that work for everybody, so that that need to refer students out or create all these different pop-up little structures, so those actually decrease.
I love how you're always you think of it on these different levels, the personal, the pedagogical, the systemic, and even the short term and the long term, and so much to think about. I think we only have time for one more question. This question probably often comes up for you around PBIS.
I was hoping you were going to pick that one.
So what do people do if they're in this system? And I would just add to the questioner, I've definitely encountered teachers in schools where they say, well, yeah, we understand theoretically why PBIS, but we do it really well here. Like, we're all about, the carrots, not the sticks, and the collective celebration, and not so. Where should people be thinking about that?
How much time do I have? So here's the thing about PBIS. I think that PBIS can have some good impacts, right? When teachers all get on the same page about giving feedback, when they notice and are attuned to when good things are happening, those can be some positive things. I really think that PBIS, even when it feels like it's working, is still reinforcing that idea of conditional acceptance, especially when we are doing points or even the grouply earned celebrations. I think it reinforces that idea of the conditional response. And so it's tricky because it's one of those things where even though maybe it's working, you want to ask yourself, what are the lessons being communicated? I think about this question that there's a principal, Chris Lehman, asks that I borrow from him all the time, which is, what is the worst consequence of my best idea? What is the worst consequence of my best idea? So you could talk in schools about what are the worst consequences of us doing PBIS, and then truly ask, are we okay with living with that? And then I see in the chat already this question about alternatives to PBIS. And I'm going to ask, I know Jeannie knows this post, and so maybe she can grab it. I have a blog post about PBIS that maybe Jeannie, you can drop in the chat. But what I say about alternatives to PBIS is that there is no program that cultivates unconditional positive regard for you. And so to me, the alternative to PBIS is actually just not doing any program, and instead investing time and building supportive peer mentoring relationships among your staff, in cultivating that care, in digging into the work so that you can live in the mess together, right? Because humanity is messy, and any of these programs that attempt to get rid of the mess all have a cost, financial and otherwise. So my alternative to PBIS is just get messy with it. And I guess that will be my closing thought for this morning.
So appreciated, Alex. Thank you so much. It's not easy, as you said in your slides as well, and but it's so necessary. So thank you for inspiring us. Thank you for helping us aspire. Thank you for all you do. Folks, please pick up Alex's book if you haven't yet, or pick up one or two for friends. And her blog, you see the link there that Jeannie put around PBIS, but there's so much there. And you can catch Alex on EduToken and other places as well. So lots of learning yet to be done there. Thank you, Alex.
Thank you all so much.
And folks, so much learning left for the rest of our day. We have sessions set up by teachers who made plans end of last June and have been thinking and working with their students up until now to share their stories. And so very lucky. We are rich in learning today. Please select your first workshop session. They'll start pretty quickly here in the next 3 to 5 minutes. There should be a link. Yep, I see it in the chat to remind you of the program and where to head. So thank you, everybody. Have a wonderful day and a great rest of your weekend. Take care now.